our parents instruct us to do something, we are expected to obey it. We may not understand why, but the reason is for our own good. How much more so when God the Father tells us to do something? I'm going to begin by telling you a story of the Israelites and the Amalekites. In Exodus 17, starting with verse 8. It says, "The Amalekites came and attacked the Israelites at Rephidim. Moses said to Joshua, 'Choose some of our men and go out to fight the Amalekites. Tomorrow I will stand on top of the hill with the staff of God in my hands.' So Joshua fought the Amalekites as Moses had ordered, and Moses, Aaron, and Hur went to the top of the hill. As long as Moses held up his hands, the Israelites were winning. But whenever he lowered his hands, the Amalekites were winning. When Moses' hands grew tired, they took a stone and put it under him, and he sat on it. Aaron and Hur held his hands up, one on one side, one on the other, so that his hands remained steady till sunset. So Joshua overcame the Amalekite army with the sword. Then the Lord said to Moses, 'Write this on a scroll as something to be remembered, and make sure that Joshua hears it, because I will completely blot out the memory of Amalek from under heaven.' Moses built an altar and called it, 'The Lord is my banner.' He said, 'For hands were lifted up to the throne of the Lord, and the Lord will be at war against the Amalekites from generation to generation.'" So who were the Amalekites? If you were to go to Genesis 36, verse 12, it says that they were the descendants of Amalek, who was a grandson of Esau. Well, for whatever reason, the Bible doesn't say why they came out and attacked the Israelites, but God did not forget. And when Moses was addressing his people for the last time, he talks about them in Deuteronomy chapter 25. Okay. Beginning with verse 17, he says, "Remember what the Amalekites did to you along the way. When you came out of Egypt, when you were weary and worn out, they met you on your journey and cut off all who were lagging behind. They had no fear of God. When the Lord your God gives you rest from the enemies around you in the land he has given you to possess as an inheritance, you shall blot out the memory of Amalek from under heaven. Do not forget." After this, Moses died, and Joshua took over as leader, and they entered the land of Canaan. And as such, they started to rid the people from that land. The Amalekites were a nomadic group. They lived between the countries of Egypt and Canaan in the desert. They were one of the many people that the Israelites never got rid of. And so they appear twice in the book of Judges. Once in 3:13 and another in chapter 6, verse 3, where they banded together with the Moabites and the Midianites and again attacked them. For the next few hundred years, they would continue to be adversarial towards them. Eventually, the judges of Israel came to an end with Samuel because Israel rejected God as their king and chose to have a human one instead. And so God chose Saul to be the first king of Israel. 1 Samuel chapter 15. Let's see. Samuel says to Saul, beginning with verse 1, "I am the one the Lord sent to you to anoint you king over his people Israel. So listen now to this message from the Lord. This is what the Lord Almighty says. I will punish the Amalekites for what they did to Israel, and when they laid them as they came up from Egypt. Now go, attack the Amalekites, and totally destroy everything that belongs to them. Do not spare them. Put to death men and women, children and infants, cattle and sheep, camels and donkeys." Now, this may seem extreme, but at certain times, God also wanted to wipe out Israel. You can think of one time when they decided to reject God and create a golden calf. Again, in verse 7, it says, "Then Saul attacked the Amalekites all the way from Havilah to Shur, to the east of Egypt. He took Agag, king of the Amalekites, alive, and all his people he totally destroyed with the sword. But Saul and the army spared Agag and the best of the sheep and cattle, the fat calves, lambs, everything that was good. They were unwilling to destroy completely, but everything that was despised and weak, they totally destroyed. Then the word of the Lord came to Samuel. I am grieved that I have made Saul king, because he has turned away from me and has not carried out my instructions. And for this reason, God took away the kingdom from Saul, and he rejected him as king. But Saul was not willing to follow what the Lord had said. Samuel even had to be the one to kill King Agag of the Amalekites. Because Samuel continued to follow the path set before him, the Amalekites still continued to exist. Saul suffered the immediate consequences of this. But because of his hesitation, other people also had to suffer, such as King David in Samuel chapter 15. Chapter 30. Okay. Beginning with verse 1, it says, David and his men reached Ziklag, and on the third day. Now the Amalekites had raided the Negev and Ziklag. They had attacked Ziklag and burned it, and had taken captive the women and all those who were in it, both young and old. They killed none of them, but carried them off as they went on their way. And when David and his men came to Ziklag, they found it destroyed by fire, and their wives and sons and daughters taken captive. So David and his men wept aloud until they had no strength left to weep. David's two wives had been captured, Ahinoam of Jezreel, Abigail, the widow of Nabal of Carmel. And David was greatly distressed because the men were talking of stoning him. Each one was bitter in spirit because of his sons and daughters. But David found strength in the Lord. From that point, David went on to rescue his wives. And it says in verse 17 of the same chapter, David fought them from dusk until the evening of the next day, and none of them got away, except 400 young men who rode off on camels and fled. See, even David was unable to completely destroy the Amalekites. And that's the last that we hear about them for a while, until of all places we come to the story of Esther. The story of Esther begins with King Xerxes throwing a party and inviting his queen Vashti to come, but she refuses. And in his anger, she is deposed as king. Soon enough, a contest was started so that another queen would take her place. The person chosen was Esther, and she was related to Mordecai. Mordecai, who stood at the city gates, overheard of an assassination plot against Xerxes and was able to stop it. But this is the focus of what I'm trying to get to. On chapter 3, it begins, After these events, King Xerxes honored Haman, son of Hammedatha the Agagite, elevating him and giving him a seat of honor higher than all the other officials and nobles. All the royal officials at the king's gate knelt down and paid honor to Haman, for the king had commanded this concerning him. But Mordecai would not kneel down or pay him honor. Then the royal officials at the king's gate asked Mordecai, Why do you disobey the king's command? Day after day he spoke to him, but he refused to comply. Therefore they told Haman about it, to see whether Mordecai's behavior would be tolerated. For he had told him he was a Jew. When Haman saw that Mordecai would not kneel down or pay him honor, he was enraged. Yet having learned who Mordecai's people were, he scorned the idea of killing only Mordecai. Instead, Haman looked for a way to destroy all of Mordecai's people, the Jews, throughout the whole kingdom of Xerxes. Now, I didn't realize why this was so significant, honestly, until about a week ago. And I was tracing the history of the Amalekites. If you look at the name Haman, it says that he is the son of Hammedatha, the Agagite. That means that Haman was a descendant of King Agag of the Amalekites. Haman was an Amalekite. And as such, he'd been put into such a position that he could wipe out God's people. This would have been one of the greatest what-ifs of history if he had been able to complete it. If only they had listened to God and done what they were supposed to. But this is far from the only time that the Israelites would not listen to God. If you follow me to Leviticus chapter 25. As Moses was giving them the commands of the Lord, it says, beginning with verse 1, chapter 25, the Lord said to Moses on Mount Sinai, "Speak to the Israelites and say to them, when you enter the land I am going to give you, the land itself must observe a Sabbath to the Lord. For 6 years sow your fields, and for 6 years prune your vineyards and gather your crops. But in the 7th year, the land is to have a Sabbath of rest, a Sabbath to the Lord. Do not sow your fields or prune your vineyards. Do not reap what grows of itself or harvest the grapes of your untended vines. The land is to have a year of rest. Whatever the land yields during the Sabbath year will be food for yourself, your manservant, and maidservant, and the hired worker and temporary resident who live among you, as well as those for your livestock and the wild animals in your field. Whatever the land produces may be eaten." Now this Sabbath year, this sabbatical year, was supposed to be a time of rest. For the land, it would be a time of restoration. Much like regenerative farming, the soil has a chance to rebuild the minerals, so it can again produce healthy crops. For the people of Israel, it was a time for redemption. Slaves would be set free. Those who were in debt, their debts would be canceled. It mentions that every 49 years, on the 50th year, they were to keep a year of Jubilee. However, the Israelites failed to keep the Sabbath year, and for that matter, the year of Jubilee. Two chapters back in chapter 19, it says this, beginning with verse 1. The Lord said to Moses, "Speak to the entire assembly of Israel, and say to them, be holy, because I, the Lord your God, am holy. Each of you must respect his father and mother, and you must observe my Sabbaths. I am the Lord your God." The key word there is Sabbaths, not one, but many. Those Sabbaths would be the 7th day, the 7th year, and the 50th year, which is the year of Jubilee. But for whatever reason, the Israelites failed to keep those except for the 7th day. Now, from the time that Moses gave the Israelites the law to the time they were exiled to Babylon was a period of 490 years. In Jeremiah 25:11, it says, "This country will become a desolate wasteland, and these nations will serve the king of Babylon 70 years. If the Israelites were to have done what God had told them to and fulfilled the Sabbath year, then this would not have happened. But if you were to notice this time of 490 years, if you were to divide it by 7th, that sabbatical year, that comes to 70. In other words, it's the 70-year period. And as 2 Chronicles 36 through 21 says, "To fulfill the word of the Lord by the mouth of Jeremiah, until the land had enjoyed its Sabbaths, all the day that it lay desolate, it kept Sabbath, to fulfill 70 years. God said that he wants us to be holy because he is holy. Before God gave the Ten Commandments in Exodus chapter 19, he says this in verse 3. Then Moses went up to God, and the Lord called to him from the mountain and said, "This is what you are to say to the house of Jacob, and what you are to tell the people of Israel. You yourselves have seen what I did to Egypt, and how I carried you on eagle's wings and brought you to myself. Now if you obey me fully and keep my covenant, then out of all the nations you will be my treasured possession. Although the whole earth is mine, you will be for me a kingdom of priests and a holy nation." God has always desired a relationship with us. It was his plan from the very beginning. When he created Adam and Eve in the Garden of Eden, they walked with him. They knew him. And he told them to work the land and that they could eat from the fruit of any tree except for the tree of knowledge of good and evil. And yet they were tempted and disobeyed him. And the immediate consequence of that is they were kicked out of the Garden of Eden. Later on, they would have faced death. Or from that time on, the consequence for them and for us was the separation from God. God knew that Adam and Eve would fail and that the Israelites would fail over and over. But yet he told them a prophecy that would come to pass. In Genesis 3:15, he says, "And I will put enmity between you and the woman, and between your offspring and hers. He will crush your head, and you will strike his heel." This speaks of the Christ, Jesus. And as Hebrews 13:8 says, Jesus Christ is the same yesterday, today, and forever. As we know, God is constant, immutable, and unchanging. I want to go back to Esther real quick. After Haman issued an edict in the king's name that called for the annihilation of all the Jews in King Xerxes' kingdom, he was put to death because Esther revealed herself to be a Jew. And Xerxes told Queen Esther and Mordecai to write another decree in the king's name on behalf of the Jews as it seems best to you, and seal it with the king's signet ring. For no document written in the king's name and sealed with his ring can be revoked. So just a couple verses later, it says in Esther 8:13, "The king's edict granted the Jews in every city the right to assemble and protect themselves, to destroy, kill, and annihilate the armed men of any nationality or province who might attack them and their women and children, and to plunder their property of their enemies." This decree protected the Jews, and it overlooked and covered the previous edict. God, like King Xerxes, does not go back on his word. But what he can do is he can cover his word. The Mosaic covenant was broken. So God had to create a new covenant. And in Jeremiah 31 through 34, beginning of verse 31, it says, "The days are coming, declares the Lord, that I will make a new covenant with the people of Israel and with the people of Judah. It will not be like the covenant I made with their ancestors when I took them by the hand to lead them out of Egypt, because they broke my covenant. Though I was a husband to them, declares the Lord. This is the covenant that I will make with the people of Israel. And after that time, declares the Lord, I will put my law in their minds and write it on their hearts. I will be their God, and they will be my people." In the time of Moses, only the Levites could be priests. They performed the sacrifices. They're the ones who performed all the rituals. But it was imperfect. The blood spilled only covered the people for a time. In Hebrews 9, verses 11 through 15, it says this, "But when Christ came as high priest of the good things that are now already here, He went through the greater and more perfect tabernacle that is not made with human hands. That is to say, he entered the most holy place once and for all by his own blood, so obtaining eternal redemption. The blood of goats and bulls and the ashes of a heifer, sprinkled on those who are ceremonial unclean, sanctify them so that they are outwardly clean. How much more then will the blood of Christ, who through the eternal Spirit of God offered himself unblemished, he cleanses our consciousness from acts that lead to death, so that we may serve the living God. And with this, God established for us a new covenant. This is also foretold in Isaiah 56. Beginning with verse 6, it says, "And the foreigners who bind themselves to the Lord, to minister to him, to love the name of the Lord and be his servants. All who keep the Sabbath without desecrating it, and all who hold fast to my covenant. These I will bring to my holy mountain, and give them joy in my house of prayer. Their burnt offerings and sacrifices will be accepted on my altar. For my house will be called a house of prayer for all nations." All those who have accepted Christ's invitation have entered into a relationship with him. We have all become priests. We worship, we minister, we pray. And as we are the church, we have also become this house of prayer. Thank you. All right. Good. I have one more thing here. Good, Doug.
Praise the Lord. Those of you that have been here on a regular basis, you know that Pastor Mario and the leadership, we believe in body ministry. In other words, the gifts that God has given you